Hello, I am back and we are going to finish up Chapter 6, The Great War. And this is from King George's book. And it is entitled The Great War. And the chapter of the Great War was a very big chapter. And so I broke it down into different topics. But we will be able to finish this. And there should be a very short reading here. But as you can see, this is King George. This is Prince Edward. And during that time, also, Bertie, who became King George VI, also served. So I'm going to go ahead and I will get started reading. The king and queen shared the wartime anxieties of all parents. Their eldest son, who was 20 in August 1914, at once joined the Grenadier Guards and began training as an infantry officer. Prince Albert was already serving as a midshipman in the battlefield Collingwood, part of the Home Fleet Guard, which was guarding the North Sea. Of the other three brothers, Prince Henry was still at Eton, Prince George was at St. Peter's and Broadstairs, and Prince John, he was subject to epilepsy fits. He was living happily in seclusion at Sandringham. It was only after a stubborn struggle with authority that the Prince of Wales received permission to serve on the Western Front. Opposition to his wishes came not so much from the king as from the government. "If I were sure you would be killed," Kirchner told him, "I do not know if it should be right to restrain you. But I cannot take the chance, which always exists until we have a settled line, of the enemy taking you as a prisoner." By November 1914, the Secretary of State for War had relented, and the prince departed for France. Even then, however, it was a lasting blow to his pride that he should be denied service in the trenches with his regiment. Beginning his tour on the staff of the commander-in-chief, 30 miles behind the lines, he contrived to have himself transferred to a divisional headquarters only 5 miles from the fighting. But whenever an attack was imminent, he was at once whisked away from the remotest chances of shell fire. He wrote bitterly to his father, "I shall have to remember the war by the various towns and places far back which were headquarters of generals I was attached to." The king was proud of his son's spirit, but neither was willing nor indeed able to overrule his advisers. The prince found a more sympathetic audience in Lady Coke, the first of those married women whose friendships were to punctuate his life. He told her in March 1915, "The Grenadiers have had 35 officers killed. Isn't it too ghastly to think of? But of course I never went near the fighting. I was kept right away as usual. Although he did not achieve his ambition of leading men into battle, he found some consolation and a measure of physical danger on the staff of Lord Cavan, the general commanding the Guards Division. Occasionally he came under fire and returned from one inspection of the trenches with Cavan to find that the driver of his car had been killed by a burst of shrapnel. Such forays, however, were not enough to still his discontent. He minded even more when sent on the unnecessary mission to Egypt for 6 weeks. He stated, "I feel such a swine having a soft, comfortable time out here, while the Guards Division is up at Ypres." Lord Edward Cecil, financial advisor to the Egyptian government and a former grenadier, wrote sardonically of the 21-year-old prince's shyness in Cairo. He is a nice boy of 15, rather immature for that age. He cannot get in or out of the room except sideways, and has the nervous smile of one accustomed to the float. He adores the regiment and would talk all day about it, but beyond love of all military matters, an outspoken hatred of politicians, and a very fine English accent when he speaks French, he has no apparent special characteristics. I think one day he will fall in love, and then he will suddenly grow up. On his return to France, the prince rejoined Cavan, now promoted to command the 14th Army Corps. He wrote in his misery to Marion Coke during the Passchendaele's offensive, I do so resent being kept back, though really I loathe going forward, and I am terrified far more than anyone else could be. But I have the devil of a big conscience, and that's the trouble, and I do feel like a soft rotter. The prince's emotional turmoil was reflected in a growing disobedience to his father. He continued to write dutiful, affectionate letters about the campaign with the king, who proudly read out to the family or to show ministers and officials. Yet there were perennial irritants in their relationship, such as the prince's addiction to violent exercise and a sparse diet. He had acquired those habits as an Oxford undergraduate in order to shine at sport. Now he pursued them with a morose ferocity as a form of self-punishment. Even after Cavan had warned him that he would have no strength left for battle. He also offended the king, for whom orders and decorations were part of the fabric of society, by refusing to wear the ribbon of the French Legion of Honor on his tunic, and by resenting the award to him of the recently instituted military cross. He stated, I do not feel I deserve it in the least, he wrote, having never served in the trenches. Besides, there are so many gallant yet undecorated officers who should have MCs long before me, who has never been out of an office. He showed the same resentment when required to spend his home leave in the family circle. The somber austerity of a royal residence in wartime could scarcely appear to any young soldier anxious to erase his memories of the Western Front. It is too nice of you to suggest a little dancing for me tomorrow night, he wrote to Lady Coke from Buckingham Palace. It will be my only chance of getting out all in the evening from this most depressing places. A few months later, when his parents asked him to spend a fortnight's leave with them at Sandringham, he told her, This little boy somehow says no. He might possibly spend 2 to 3 days there, but no more, not for nobody. The gulf between the father and son, as much of temperament as of age, had begun to widen. Prince Albert was proving a more tractable son, and in the face of continual and mishandled illness, he was a courageous one too. Throughout the war, his naval service was again and again interrupted by a succession of gastric illnesses, which 2 surgical operations and prolonged diet failed to relieve. He nevertheless rose from a sickbed to resume his duties in a gun turret at HMS Collingwood during the Battle of Jutland, and was mentioned in dispatches. It was a characteristic of this shy, thoughtful boy that even while under treatment in a nursing home and fretting at his own inglorious fate, he should have written to his father, You must be very tired after all this trying time with so much work to do. and so many people to see, and never getting any rest. The king and queen were spared anxiety about the health and safety of their third son, Prince Henry. 14 at the outbreak of the war, he had in 1913 been sent to Eton, just across the River Thames from Windsor, where he remained for the next 5 years. He was a modest, kind, and good-mannered boy, but without intellectual or athletic gifts, and he often rebuked for inattention. The king, who wisely insisted that Harry should concentrate on modern languages at the expense of the school's traditional diet of Latin verses, was disappointed by his son's progress. He was also indignant at the way in which Etonians failed to remove their hats when he and the queen drove by, merely touching their brims with a languid forefinger. Prince Henry, destined for the regular army, showed little early promise for soldiering, joining the school officers' training corps in 1914. He was he was not promoted to lance corporal until 4 years later, when on the point of leaving for the Royal Military College, Sandhurst. He did, however, surprise his parents by passing the entrance exam halfway up the list. Basking in a rare message of paternal congratulations, he wrote to his old tutor, Henry Hansel, "Mama and Papa are delighted. They think rather more of Eton than they did before." Prince George, nearly 3 years his junior, was still at St. Peter's before joining the Navy as a cadet. He was cheerful, alert, and a well-balanced boy. He encountered fewer problems than his brothers, whom he outshone in the classroom. Alone of Queen Mary's children, he shared her love of furniture and paintings, of books and biblots. Prince Henry, by contrast, was to leave Cambridge after a year as an officer undergraduate without having once set foot inside the treasure house of museums. Although the king and queen were able to celebrate both their silver wedding and the coming of peace untouched by personal bereavement, their relief and thanksgiving soon gave way to sorrow. In January 1919, Prince John died suddenly at Sandringham after an epileptic attack. The Queen wrote to a friend, "For him it is a great release. I cannot say how grateful we feel to God for having taken him in such a peaceful way. He slept quietly into his heavenly home. No pain, no struggle, just peace for the poor little troubled spirit." Outwardly stoical, she mourned in her heart the loss of her youngest child and the first break in the family circle. Okay, this next section is the last part of the chapter, and it's very brief, and it's about victory for World War I, the Great War. Very often I feel in despair," the king told his wife. "And if it wasn't for you, I should break down." In the 4th year of war, the strain began to show. Curzon noticed that the little man's stumpy beard is getting quite white at that point. Wigram wrote to a fellow private secretary from Windsor, "The atmosphere here has been decidedly low, and I've been endeavoring to assure the king that it is the last battle that wins the war. It is unfortunate the royal family do not go to public schools and learn to play a losing game on the cricket or football fields." It was both naive and patronizing of Wigram to suppose that the king's training as a naval officer had been less a grueling test of character than his own conquests on the playing fields of Winchester. The king's fitful depression was a matter of temperament, not of upbringing. He displayed every quality required of a constitutional monarch except optimism. But even a more euphoric sovereign who had reigned for 8 such troubled years might have wondered whether the clouds would ever lift. The king was sickened by the carnage that continued to take its monthly toll by the 100,000, yet seemed to bring victory no nearer. His thoughts echoed those despairing lines from Thomas Hardy. I have beheld the agonies of war through many a weary season, and seen enough to make me hold that scarcely any goal is worth the reaching by so red a road. Changes in the Allied High Command failed to break the deadlock on the Western Front. Indeed, it was the Germans who, in March 1918, launched an offensive that smashed the British Fifth Army and threatened the Channel ports and drove back the French from the Aisne to the Marne. Adoption of the convoy system reduced the losses of the British shipping from the U-boat attacks. But the decisive battle that was to sweep the German fleet from the North Sea eluded both Admiral Jellicoe and his more enterprising successors, Admiral Beatty. Russia was lost to the Allied cause, although the entry to the United States offered a gleam of hope from the West. It was the king, more understanding than his prime ministers, who pointed out that a message of welcome to American troops should omit a reference to their not being seasoned. Reverses on land and sea, continual friction between Buckingham Palace and Downing Street. Anxiety about his own sons and his Russian cousins. Those worries were aggravated by the growth of republicanism and a revival of xenophobic hysteria, which the proclamation of the House of Windsor had done little to avert. It was disheartening for the king to practice virtue yet be identified with tyranny, to live austerely, hand over savings of £100,000 of treasury, and drive himself to the limit of endurance with state papers and public appearances, yet be reminded by Ramsay MacDonald that it is the red flag which now floats over the imperial palace in Petrograd. As for the renewed hounding of those with foreign blood, Leo Emery noted in his July 1918, the poor king is very annoyed and indignant over the alien hunt. The latest proposal, if applied all around, would presumably involve his submitting himself to Justice Banks' committee to justify his functioning as king, and would certainly involve his having to drop the name of Windsor again for the original German name, whatever it is. Poor Mountbatten would also have to lose not only his name, but his seat in the Privy Council. Then suddenly the tide of battle turned. The German offensive faltered, and the Allied armies under the Marshal Foch struck back. Throughout August and September, the enemy were on the run, leaving no fewer than 350,000 of their men as prisoners. The king's dejection gave way to contemptuous anger. Max of Baden has now become chancellor and wants to start negotiating for peace. At the same time, the Germans continued to burn the houses and towns and villages in France as they retreat. Curious ideas of peace. Turkey surrendered on 30 October, Austria on 4 November, Germany a week later. Today, the king wrote on 11 November, he has indeed been a wonderful day, the greatest in history of the country. As of the 4th of August, 1914, the population of London streamed down the Mall to salute the man who so modestly embodied the nation's pride. Night after night, he and the Queen were called to the palace balcony to receive their homage. By the day, they drove through the capital in an open carriage to cheer that had acquired a note of affection as well as deliverance and joy. This has repaid us for much hard work and many moments of keen and bitter anxiety, the Queen wrote to one of her children. There was a more intimate celebration, too. The King went to the theater for the first time in 5 years. His unlikely choice was The Bing Boys of Broadway. I just wonder, I'm just going to see what some of those pictures look like. Here. Oh, that's Churchill. Okay. Anyway. By day, they drove through the capital in an open carriage to cheers that had acquired a note of affection as well as deliverance and joy. This has repaid us for much hard work and many moments of keen and bitter anxiety, the Queen wrote to one of her children. There was a more intimate celebration, too. The King went to the theater for the first time in 5 years. His unlikely choice was The Bing Boys of Broadway. I've already read that part, but in the midst of his triumph, the King did not forget the general whose Western Front strategy had survived both the armed might of Germany and the subtler attentions of the British Prime Minister. He telegraphed to Haig, "It is through your military knowledge and ability, combined with patient resolve, that you've led the British armies to victory." The country was denied knowledge of his tribute. Stamfordham had decided against its publication in case Lloyd George would object. Beatty, too, received a memorable mark of royal favor. The monarch who has sometimes gone down in history as the Sailor King declined to accept the surrender of the German fleet in person, lest it eclipse his old shipmate's hour of glory. For the common man, for the civilian in uniform, the King showed the same humble admiration. And for those of them who suffered in body or mind, a shy but paternal concern. Soon after the armistice, he reviewed more than 30,000 disabled soldiers and sailors in Hyde Park. In their enthusiasm, they broke ranks and almost pulled the King from his horse. Each later received a copy of his speech. I am glad to have met you today, it began, and to have looked into the faces of those who, for the defense of the home and the empire, were ready to give up their all, and they have sacrificed limbs, sight, hearing, and health. This was no fleeting sentiment to be uttered and soon forgotten. In the following year, the king watched the first post-war running of the Derby at Epsom. Gazing down from the royal box, he saw that the crowd had suddenly parted to let through a long line of disabled men in hospital blue, walking slowly and painfully. The king jerked his hand towards them. "They have paid the price for us," he said in his gruff voice. "Without them, there would be no Derby today." And that is the end of the chapter on the Great War. So the next is post-war issues and situations that came up after the war. And the chapter is called Chapter 7, The Restless Decade. So I'm just going to take that out. Yeah, it's entitled The Restless Decade, and it talks about a changing monarchy, peace of a sort, Irish settlement, money, honors for sale, honors not for sale, upheavals at number 10, and my dear Horace. So this is chapter 7, and I will take a break for today, and we will begin reading that tomorrow. So he had quite a lot to deal with during his reign. It's every monarch has their own set of issues to deal with. So, and this is King George. So I will see you tomorrow, and we will get started on reading chapter 7. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening.